A young widow, living out of her car, finally gets a voucher for a $5 a night motel. But what she discovered hidden behind its crumbling walls would unravel a secret that would change her life forever. If you've ever felt like you've hit rock bottom, only to find a glimmer of hope in the most unexpected place, then this story is for you. And if you have a story of your own, I hope you'll consider subscribing and sharing it in the comments below, because this is a community for people who understand that the hardest times can lead to the most important truths. The slip of paper in my hand felt colder than the November air biting at my cheeks. It was thin, flimsy, a carbon copy whose faint blue letters spelled out a temporary reprieve. Emergency housing voucher, it read. Below that, in the severe, all-caps font of bureaucracy, motel placement, 7 nights. The name of the place was the Sundown Inn, a name that felt less like a gentle promise and more like a final warning. Ms. Albright, the social worker, had pushed it across her metal desk with a sigh that was equal parts pity and exhaustion. "It's not the Hilton, Sarah," she'd said, her voice raspy from a day of similar conversations. "But it's a roof. It's a lock on the door. It's better than the car." She wasn't wrong. For the last 53 nights, my world had been a 2008 sedan with a cracked windshield and a driver's seat that wouldn't recline all the way. Home was the back corner of a 24-hour grocery store parking lot, the constant hum of freezer trucks, a lullaby of last resort. Home was the ache in my spine and the fog of my breath on the inside of the glass. 2 years ago, home was a 2-bedroom house with a garden David had been so proud of. 2 years ago, I had a husband. Now, I had a voucher for the Sundown Inn. The drive there was short, a journey of less than 3 miles that felt like crossing into another country, one where the colors were muted and the buildings all seemed to sag in the middle. The Sundown Inn was a long, 2-story structure of faded mint green stucco, punctuated by orange doors that had been painted so many times the original lines were soft and bloated. A neon sign sputtered above the office, the S and D in Sundown dark, leaving a less than comforting message, "Unown Inn." It felt fitting. I felt unowned, untethered from everything I had ever known as mine. I parked the car, my entire collection of worldly possessions visible in the back seat, and took a deep breath. The air smelled of wet asphalt and something vaguely fried. I clutched the voucher and my purse, my knuckles white. This was it, a step up. It was supposed to feel like a step up. So why did it feel like I was just finding a more permanent place to fall? The office door buzzed loudly when I pushed it open, announcing my arrival to a man sitting behind a plexiglass shield. He was watching a tiny television and didn't look up. "Hello?" I said, my voice small. He glanced at me, then at the voucher I placed on the counter, sliding it under the gap in the plexiglass. He picked it up with 2 fingers, as if it were contaminated. His eyes scanned it, flickered back to my face, and then returned to the paper. "Room 207, he grunted, dropping a key on the counter. It wasn't a card key, but a real, old-fashioned metal key attached to a large plastic diamond with the numbers 207 worn almost smooth. "Second floor, on the back side. Checkout is 11. Don't smoke in the room. Don't cook in the room. Don't have visitors after 10. He rattled off the rules without inflection, his gaze already drifting back to the flickering television. There was no welcome, no kindness, just a transaction. I was not a guest. I was a line item, a voucher to be processed. "Thank you," I whispered, though he wasn't listening. I took the key. It was heavy, solid, real. A real key to a real door. For 7 nights, I would be able to turn this key in a lock and be on the other side of a wall. It was a pathetic thing to be grateful for, but the gratitude was there, a tiny, stubborn ember in the cold ash of my life. I walked out of the office, the buzzer sounding my departure, and looked up at the second-floor walkway. Room 207. I started toward the concrete stairs at the end of the building, each step a conscious effort. One foot in front of the other. That's what David used to say when things got hard. Just one foot in front of the other, Sarah. We'll get there. But he was gone, and I was here, climbing the stained steps of a motel that had given up on itself decades ago, wondering if there was anywhere left to get to. My hand tightened around the key. A lock on a door. It was a start. The walkway on the second floor was a narrow concrete ledge, open to the elements. A biting wind whipped around the corner of the building, carrying the smell of rain and exhaust. The metal railing was cold and damp beneath my hand. Each orange door I passed seemed to hold its own story of quiet desperation. A flicker of a television screen through a gap in the curtains, the muffled sound of a cough, the faint, sweet smell of marijuana clinging to the air. This was a place people came when they had nowhere else to go. I was one of them now. Room 207 was the third door from the end. The paint was peeling near the doorknob, revealing layers of previous colors like a sad archaeology of neglect. I stood before it for a long moment, the key in my hand. This was the threshold. For 53 nights, my only privacy had been tinted windows and a sunshade. Now, there was a door. A solid, if battered, door. My hand was shaking as I inserted the key into the lock. It resisted at first, the mechanism stiff and gritty. But with a jiggle and a firm twist, I felt the tumbler give way with a satisfying clunk. I pushed the door open and was hit with a wall of scent. Stale cigarette smoke, chemical air freshener, and the deep, abiding musk of 1,000 transient lives. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, leaning against it. The sound of the latch clicking into place was thunderous in the sudden quiet. I was alone. I was inside. The relief was so profound, so overwhelming, that my knees went weak. I slid down the door until I was sitting on the thin, scratchy carpet, and I finally let myself cry. It wasn't a loud, dramatic sob, but a silent, wrenching cascade of tears I hadn't allowed myself for weeks. I cried for David. I cried for the house with the garden. I cried for the woman I used to be, the one who worried about what to make for dinner, not where she would sleep. And I cried in gratitude for this shabby, lonely room. After a few minutes, the wave of emotion passed, leaving me hollowed out and exhausted. I got to my feet and took a proper look at my sanctuary for the next week. The room was small, dominated by a queen-sized bed with a thin, brown bedspread patterned with faded gold diamonds. A dark, particle-board headboard was bolted to the wall behind it. To the left was a small desk and chair, also made of dark, cheap wood, with a lamp whose shade was dented. A bulky television from the early 2000s sat on a matching dresser across from the bed. The carpet, a swirling pattern of indeterminate brown and beige, was worn thin in the path from the door to the bed, and there were several dark, mysterious stains near the desk. The window looked out over the back parking lot and a chain-link fence bordering a desolate-looking field. The curtains were a heavy, sun-bleached fabric that didn't quite meet in the middle, leaving a permanent sliver of gray sky visible. I walked over and touched the glass. It was cold, and a draft snaked in from the edges of the frame. This was the source of the room's persistent chill. I pulled the curtains shut as tightly as I could. It didn't do much. Next, I inspected the bathroom. It was tiny, with a yellowing fiberglass shower stall, a toilet, and a small sink with a dripping faucet. The mirror over the sink had a crack running through the lower corner, fracturing my reflection. I looked tired, older than my 31 years. There were dark circles under my eyes, and my hair was limp. I saw the ghost of the woman David had loved, but she was fading. I turned away from the mirror, I couldn't look at her. Back in the main room, I sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress groaned under my weight and sagged in the middle, a valley carved by countless other bodies. I lay back, my hands behind my head, and stared at the ceiling. It was a landscape of water stains, a pale, brownish map of old leaks and forgotten repairs. It was ugly. It was depressing, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It was a ceiling. It was solid. Nothing was going to fall on me. The rain, which had started to patter against the window, couldn't touch me. For the first time in almost 2 months, I was safe from the weather. I thought about David. He would have hated this place. Not because it was cheap, but because he would have hated that I was in it. He was a builder, a fixer. He saw the world in terms of what was broken and how he could make it whole again. He would have immediately started diagnosing the room's problems. He'd have caulked the window, tightened the faucet, probably figured out a way to prop up the sagging mattress. The thought brought a fresh pang of grief, sharp and sudden. His absence was a physical presence in the room, a silence where his cheerful problem-solving should have been. He had always been the one to make things better. His final illness was the one thing he couldn't fix, the one project he had to leave unfinished. And I was the collateral damage. I closed my eyes, the rhythmic drip from the bathroom faucet and the patter of the rain forming a somber, lonely percussion. 7 nights. I had to make it count. I had to use this brief respite to figure out what came next. But for tonight, it was enough just to be still. It was enough to be inside. The first night was an adjustment. I'd grown so accustomed to the specific discomforts of the car, the way I had to curl my body to fit on the back seat, the constant low-level alertness to any sound outside, that the relative luxury of the motel bed felt alien. The mattress, despite its sag, was soft. The pillow, though lumpy, was still a pillow. I lay awake for hours, listening to the buildings settle around me. The hum of the ice machine down the hall, the sound of a television in the next room, the rush of water through pipes in the walls. These were the sounds of life, of other people existing nearby, and yet I had never felt more alone. I missed the familiar, cramped space of the sedan. It was a miserable cage, but it had been my cage. This room, with its anonymous furniture and stained carpet, felt like someone else's failure, and I was just borrowing it for a while. The next morning, I woke to gray light filtering through the gap in the curtains. My back ached from the dip in the mattress, but I had slept for 6 straight hours, a record for me. The first order of business was a shower. A hot shower. In the car, my hygiene had been a patchwork of public restroom sinks and wet wipes. The thought of standing under a stream of hot water felt like an impossible indulgence. The shower stall was grim, with mildew darkening the grout, but the water that came out of the nozzle was hot and the pressure was decent. I stood there for a long time, letting the water run over my head and shoulders, washing away the grime and some of the exhaustion. I was using the motel's water, the motel's heat. I wasn't paying for it by the minute. It was a small freedom, but it felt immense. Afterward, wrapped in one of the thin, starchy towels, I felt marginally more human. I had a few changes of clothes in a duffel bag in the car, along with a box of photos and David's old laptop, its battery long dead. I decided to bring them in. It wasn't safe to leave them in the car, and more than that, I wanted something of my own in this sterile room. Making 2 trips, I brought my meager possessions inside, setting the box on the desk and the duffel bag on the floor. Seeing David's laptop sitting there felt both comforting and painful. It was a relic from a dead world. I had no way to charge it, and even if I did, I wasn't sure I was ready to see what was on it. The days began to fall into a strange, suspended rhythm. I spent most of my time in the room. I had a little cash saved, enough for cheap food from the convenience store down the road, instant noodles, granola bars, things that didn't require cooking. I'd sit at the little desk, eating my noodles and staring out the window, watching the few cars that came and went from the back lot. I tried to use the time productively. I had a cheap notebook and I made lists. Lists of jobs to apply for. Lists of potential resources for housing assistance. But the tasks felt monumental, and my motivation was a flickering candle in a strong wind. The weight of my situation was paralyzing. The room, my supposed sanctuary, started to feel like a cell. The same four walls, the same stained carpet, the same dripping faucet. The draft from the window was a constant, nagging presence. The chill in the room was pervasive, seeping into my bones. By the third night, I couldn't stand it anymore. The cold air seemed to be coming from directly behind the bed. I got up and pushed the heavy mattress aside, trying to get a better look at the wall behind the headboard. The headboard was bolted to the wall, but there was a small gap between the bottom of it and the floor. The draft was stronger there. Annoyed, I lay on the floor, my cheek pressed against the scratchy carpet, and peered into the gap. The wallpaper behind the headboard was a different pattern from the rest of the room, a faded floral design that had probably been covered over decades ago. And in one spot, near the floor, a corner of it was peeling away. It was more than peeling, actually. It looked like it had been cut. A faint, straight line was visible in the dim light. It was just a tiny imperfection, the kind of thing you'd never notice unless you were looking for it. The kind of thing you'd only notice if you were cold and bored and trapped in a room for 3 days. Curiosity, a feeling I hadn't experienced in a long time, stirred within me. It was a flicker of something other than grief or fear. I reached out and hooked a finger under the loose corner of the wallpaper. It came away from the wall easily, silently, and behind it was not drywall. It was another layer of wallpaper, but this one had a definite rectangular seam. It looked like a small, deliberate patch. My heart started to beat a little faster. This was strange. This was intentional. I pressed my fingers against the patch. It felt different from the surrounding wall, firmer, harder. I knocked on it gently with my knuckle. The sound was a dull thud. I knocked on the wall next to it, a hollow, resonant tap. There was something behind that patch, something solid. I sat up, my mind racing. What could it be? A utility panel? A botched repair job? Or something else? The thought was absurd, the stuff of movies. People didn't hide things in the walls of rundown motels. But the evidence was right there. The cut wallpaper, the strange patch, the solid object behind it. I spent the rest of the night unable to sleep, my mind circling back to the wall. It was probably nothing. I was probably letting my imagination run away with me, a side effect of isolation and stress. And yet, the feeling wouldn't go away. David had been a builder. He knew walls. He knew how to hide things, how to make a space look untouched. The thought was a wild leap, connecting my dead husband to a random motel room, but it lodged in my brain and refused to leave. The next morning, fueled by coffee and a sleepless night, I knew I couldn't leave it alone. I had to know what was behind that patch. I had 3 more days on my voucher, 3 more days in room 207. Whatever this was, it felt like it was a secret meant for me. My toolkit consisted of a nail file and the edge of the motel room key. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I pushed the bed as far away from the wall as it would go, giving myself a few feet of space to work. My heart was hammering against my ribs. This was crazy. I could get in trouble. I could be kicked out. I could lose the one safe place I had. But the pull of the mystery was stronger than the fear. It was a purpose, a tiny pinprick of light in the suffocating darkness of my grief. I started with the nail file, trying to pry at the edges of the wallpaper patch. The old paper was brittle and flaked away, revealing the seam more clearly. It was a rectangle, about the size of a shoebox lid, cut into a sheet of thin plywood that had been used to cover a hole in the original drywall. This was definitely a patch job, but it was neat, too neat for the general state of disrepair in the rest of the room. Someone had taken their time with this. I slid the tip of the key into the seam, and gently worked it back and forth. A fine powder of old plaster and dust sifted onto the carpet. Slowly, painstakingly, I managed to widen the gap. It was like performing surgery with a spoon. My fingers were sore, my knuckles scraped against the rough wall. After what felt like an hour, I had loosened one entire side of the small plywood panel. I wedged my fingers into the gap and pulled. It resisted, held in place by something. I pulled harder, gritting my teeth. With a low groan of stressed wood and a soft tearing sound, the panel came free in my hands. I fell back, my breath catching in my throat. I was staring into a dark, rectangular cavity in the wall. It was a space between the studs, a void that had been deliberately concealed. And inside that void, nestled in a bed of old, yellowed insulation, was a small metal box. It wasn't a safe. It was more like a fishing tackle box, painted dark green with a simple clasp on the front. It was old, a little rusty at the hinges, but it was clean. It hadn't been sitting there for 50 years. It felt more recent. My hands were trembling as I reached into the wall and lifted the box out. It was heavier than I expected. Not incredibly heavy, but it had a definite weight to it. I set it on the carpet in front of me and just stared at it. My mind was a whirlwind of impossible questions. Who put this here? When? Why? Was it something dangerous? Something illegal? Was this some kind of drop point for criminals? My first instinct was to put it back, seal the wall, and pretend I never saw it. It was safer not to know. But then my eyes fell on the key in my hand. Room 207. And a memory, distant and foggy, surfaced. An anniversary dinner, years ago. David had surprised me with a weekend trip. A nice hotel, not a place like this. But I remembered him joking as he'd unlocked the door. Room 207, he'd said, smiling. 2 for you and me, and 07 for the luckiest day of my life. February 7th, the day we had met. It was our number. He always looked for it. Flights, hotel rooms, ticket numbers. It was his little superstition. Our lucky number. Coincidence? It had to be. It was insane to think otherwise. And yet, the thought took root. What if it wasn't a coincidence? What if David, somehow, had put this here? But how? Why? He'd been so sick at the end. We'd lost the house. We had nothing. I watched him waste away, helpless. He wouldn't have been traveling, staying in motels. It didn't make any sense. I looked at the box. The simple clasp was unlocked. It would be so easy to open. Just a flick of my thumb. All my fear, all my instincts for self-preservation were screaming at me to leave it alone. But a deeper, more powerful feeling was rising up to meet them. Hope. A terrifying, irrational hope. The hope that this wasn't random. The hope that this was a message. A final word from the man I loved. My hand reached for the clasp. My thumb rested on the cool metal. I took a deep, shaky breath, and I opened the box. The contents were sparse, almost anticlimactic. There was no treasure, no stacks of cash, no jewels. The box held only 2 items. The first was a single, old-fashioned car key, the kind without a plastic fob, attached to a simple metal ring. The second was a single sheet of paper, folded into a small square. My fingers, numb with a mixture of disappointment and adrenaline, fumbled as I picked up the folded note. It was a page torn from a cheap spiral notebook. The handwriting was messy, rushed, but I recognized it instantly. It was David's. My breath hitched, a wave of dizziness washed over me. It was real. This was from him. I unfolded the paper with trembling hands. The message was short, just a few lines scrawled in blue ink. "My Sarah," it began. The words blurred as my eyes filled with tears. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and things got as bad as I was afraid they would." I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for everything. I tried to fix it. This is all I could do. The car is in the long-term lot at the airport. Section G, space 42. The key fits. Everything you need to know is inside. And Sarah, room 207. It was always our number. I love you more than all the stars. I read the note 3 times, my mind struggling to process the words. The airport? A car? What was he talking about? We had sold his truck months before he died to pay for medication. My sedan was the only car we had left. This key wasn't for my car. And what did he mean, everything you need to know is inside? Inside the car? The note raised 1,000 more questions than it answered. I sank back against the wall, the note clutched in my hand, the key cold against my palm. The grief I had been holding at bay for months crashed over me. It wasn't just sadness for his loss, it was a profound, aching confusion. His last months had been a blur of hospital visits, hushed conversations with doctors, and the relentless, soul-crushing paperwork of mounting debt. He had been so weak, so tired. Where would he have found the energy, the time, the secrecy to arrange all this? To rent a motel room, hide a box in the wall, buy a car, and leave it at the airport? It felt like I was learning about a stranger. The David I had nursed had been a man defeated, a man whose body and spirit were being consumed by illness. But this note, this was the old David, the planner, the fixer, the man who always had a trick up his sleeve, a solution in his back pocket. He hadn't been defeated at all. He had been fighting, in secret, without me. A knot of anger tightened in my chest, mingling with the grief. Why didn't he tell me? We were a team. We faced everything together. Why would he shut me out at the end? I looked around the shabby motel room, room 207. He had chosen it. He had been here. He had stood in this room, cut into this wall, and placed this box here for me to find. The thought was staggering. He had foreseen this. He had known I would lose the house. He had known I would end up with nothing. He had known I would be desperate enough to take an emergency voucher for a place like this. And he had counted on our lucky number to guide me here. It was an impossible, ridiculous, beautiful plan. Now I had a choice. I had a key and a location. The airport was a 40-minute bus ride away. I had almost no money left. Going out there would be a gamble. What if the car wasn't there? What if the note was some kind of cruel joke? What if the key didn't work? It could all be a wild goose chase that would leave me with even less than I had now. The safe option was to stay here, in my chilly room, and use my last few days of guaranteed shelter to try and find a job, to follow the sensible lists I had made. But as I sat there on the floor, the peeling wallpaper and the dust motes dancing in the sliver of light from the window, I knew I couldn't do that. This was David's last act, his last message to me. It wasn't just a clue. It was a lifeline. He had thrown it to me from the past, a desperate, brilliant, secret act of love. Ignoring it would be like letting him die all over again. I had to see it through. I had to know what he had hidden for me. I folded the note carefully and put it in my pocket along with the key. I pushed the small metal box back into the cavity in the wall and fitted the plywood panel back in place. I nudged the bed back against the wall, hiding the evidence of my discovery. The room looked exactly as it had before, but for me, everything had changed. The room was no longer a symbol of my failure. It was the site of a miracle. It was the first stop on a map David had left just for me. Tomorrow I would go to the airport. Tomorrow I would find out what he had tried so hard to tell me. And listen, if you've ever had to make a choice between the safe path and a leap of faith, I see you. It's a terrifying place to be. Sometimes the biggest risks are the ones we have to take to honor the people we've lost, or to reclaim a part of ourselves. If this is hitting you right now, I want you to know you're not alone in that feeling. This community is built on people who understand those impossible choices. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had to follow a sign you couldn't explain. Your story matters. Now, let's get back to what happened. The bus ride to the airport was a journey through a landscape of anxiety. Every stop, every new passenger felt like an obstacle, a delay. I clutched the key in my pocket, its sharp edges digging into my palm. The note was in my other pocket, a fragile, crinkling reassurance. I had just enough money for a round-trip ticket with a few dollars to spare. If this was a dead end, I'd be walking back. The airport was a shock to the system. After weeks of quiet isolation, the noise and motion were overwhelming. People rushing to gates, announcements echoing from the ceiling, the constant roll of suitcases on tile. I felt small and out of place, a ghost haunting the edges of other people's purposeful lives. I followed the signs for long-term parking, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm against my ribs. The shuttle bus to the lots was crowded and smelled of jet fuel. I stared out the window as we passed row after row of cars, a vast, silent herd of metal and glass. The shuttle dropped me at a shelter in the middle of the sprawling lot. A sign pointed the way, sections F to J. I started walking, my eyes scanning the posts for the letter G. The wind was fierce out here, whipping across the open expanse of asphalt. It felt like I was walking for miles. Finally, I saw it. A tall sign with a large G painted on it. I turned down the aisle, my gaze jumping from car to car, then to the small numbers painted on the pavement at the head of each space. G28, G30, G32. I was getting closer. My breathing grew shallow. What kind of car would it be? A beat-up sedan like my own? A practical station wagon? David had always loved old, sturdy cars. He appreciated things that were built to last. I reached the end of the row, G40, G42, and there it was. It was not what I expected. Sitting in space G42 was a dusty, unassuming, dark blue minivan. It was at least 10 years old, a model I'd seen 100 times on the road, the kind of vehicle used for hauling kids to soccer practice. It was utterly anonymous. There was a thin layer of grime on the windows, and a few leaves had collected under the windshield wipers. It looked like it had been sitting here for a while. I walked a slow circle around it. There were a few small dings and scratches, but otherwise, it seemed to be in decent shape. I took a deep breath and approached the driver's side door. This was the moment of truth. I pulled the key from my pocket. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely fit it into the lock. I pushed it in. It slid home. I turned it. Click. The sound of the lock disengaging was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. It was real. The car was real. The key worked. I pulled the handle and the heavy door swung open. I leaned inside, a wave of emotion making me dizzy. The interior didn't smell new, but it smelled clean. And it smelled, ever so faintly, of him. That mix of sawdust, coffee, and something uniquely David. He had been in this van. He had driven it. He had sat in this very seat. I slid into the driver's seat and closed the door, shutting out the wind and the noise of the lot. For a moment, I just sat there, my hands on the steering wheel, and let the reality of it sink in. He had done this. For me. The anger I had felt before was gone, replaced by a profound and aching tenderness. He hadn't shut me out to punish me. He had shut me out to protect me. Whatever he had been doing, he hadn't wanted me to be a part of it. This van, this whole elaborate secret, was his way of building one last wall around me, a final project to keep me safe. I looked around the van's interior. The glove compartment was locked. I tried the key, and it opened. Inside was the vehicle registration and proof of insurance, all in his name. And tucked behind them was a thick, sealed manila envelope with my name, Sarah, written on the front in his familiar scrawl. I pulled it out. It was heavy, dense. My fingers traced the letters of my name. I wasn't ready to open it yet. I needed a minute. I placed the envelope on the passenger seat and started searching the rest of the van. He had been so thoughtful, so meticulous. In the center console, there was a small digital audio recorder, the kind journalists use. On the floor of the passenger side was a duffel bag. I unzipped it. It was filled with clothes, men's clothes, work shirts, sturdy jeans, boots, and under the clothes was a laptop case. I opened it. It was his old laptop, the one I thought was broken beyond repair. But next to it was a brand new power cord. I moved to the back of the van. The rear seats were folded down, creating a large, flat cargo space. In the back, tucked against the tailgate, was a heavy-duty black plastic footlocker, the kind contractors use to store tools. It was secured with a small padlock. I searched the van for a key, but couldn't find one. Then I remembered the registration in the glove compartment. I went back and looked at the paperwork more closely. The van was registered to an address I didn't recognize, a post office box in a town 50 miles away. And stapled to the registration was a tiny key, the key to the padlock. My hands were clumsy as I unlocked the footlocker. I lifted the heavy lid. I wasn't prepared for what I saw. The footlocker was filled, nearly to the brim, with cash. Bundles of 20s, 50s, and 100s, all neatly wrapped in rubber bands. It wasn't $1 million, but it was more money than I had ever seen in my life. I reached in and touched one of the bundles. The paper was crisp, real. I lifted it out. There must have been thousands of dollars in that one stack alone. And there were dozens of stacks. I sat back on my heels, stunned into silence. Where had this come from? David and I had been drowning in medical debt. We had emptied our savings, our retirement accounts. We had nothing left. For him to have accumulated this much cash, it wasn't possible. Not legally. My mind immediately went to a dark place. Had he done something terrible? Had he gotten involved with criminals? Was this blood money? The thought made me feel sick. I looked at the cash, at this impossible solution to all my problems, and I felt a wave of fear and revulsion. I couldn't touch this money if it was dirty. I wouldn't. It would be a betrayal of everything he and I had stood for. Then my eyes fell on the manila envelope still sitting on the passenger seat. Everything you need to know is inside. The answers were there. The truth, whatever it was in that envelope. I crawled back into the driver's seat, my body feeling heavy and old. I picked up the envelope. It felt like it weighed 100 pounds. This was the real test. Not finding the car, not finding the money. The test was opening this envelope and facing the truth of what my husband had become in his final months. I took a deep breath, tore open the seal, and began to read. The envelope contained two things: a thick stack of letters bound with a rubber band, and a smaller, sealed envelope marked, "For a lawyer." I set the smaller one aside and slipped the rubber band off the letters. They were all in his handwriting, dated over a period of about 6 months, leading up to the week he died. I took the first one from the top of the stack. "My Sarah," it began, just like the note in the motel room. "If you're reading these, it means our lucky number worked. It means you found the box, and you found the van. I'm proud of you. I knew you were strong enough. I have to tell you things I couldn't say to your face, not because I didn't trust you, but because I couldn't bear to see the look in your eyes. After the third diagnosis, when the doctors told me it was a matter of time, and not much of it, I started to panic. Not about dying. I was scared, but I'd started to make my peace with that. I was panicking about you. The bank was already sending letters about the house. The medical bills were a mountain we could never climb. I would lie awake at night, picturing you losing everything, picturing you alone in your car, and it was 1,000 times worse than any physical pain. I knew I had to do something. My life insurance was voided by a clause about pre-existing conditions we'd never noticed. Our savings were gone. I was too sick to work a normal construction job. I was useless. Or so I thought. He went on to explain. Through an old acquaintance from a construction site, he'd heard about a job. Long haul, expedited logistics. It was a gray market operation. They hired drivers with their own vehicles to transport goods for clients who wanted things moved quickly and with no questions asked. It wasn't drugs or weapons, he insisted in the letter. It was mostly high-end electronics, designer goods, sensitive corporate documents, things that were time-sensitive or that companies didn't want logged in a major shipping firm's database. The pay was in cash, and it was very, very good. But it was grueling work, under the table, with no insurance or protections. He bought the minivan with the last of a small emergency fund he'd kept hidden from me. He told me he was going to a new experimental treatment program in another state. It was a lie. He was driving. He would drive for days at a time, hopped up on caffeine and painkillers, pushing his failing body to its absolute limit. He'd drive from Chicago to Miami, from Dallas to Seattle, sleeping in the back of the van for a few hours before starting again. Every dollar he made, he stashed in the footlocker. I was a ghost, he wrote. I'd call you from a rest stop and try to sound normal, try to sound tired from treatment, when really I was exhausted from driving 16 hours straight. It was tearing me apart, lying to you. But every time I looked at the money growing in the box, I knew I had to keep going. It was my penance, I guess, for getting sick, for failing to provide for you in the normal way. This was the only way I had left to build something for you. Not a house, but a future, a foundation. I read through letter after letter. They were a chronicle of his last months, a secret diary of pain, exhaustion, and fierce, stubborn love. He described the lonely highways at night, the sketchy warehouses where he'd pick up and drop off shipments, the close calls with exhaustion on the road. He wrote about how he found the Sundown Inn on one of his last trips when he was too sick to drive any further. He saw the room number, 207, and knew it was a sign. He spent 2 days there, carefully hiding the first clue, his body racked with fever, knowing he was running out of time. I cried as I read. I cried for his pain, for his loneliness, for the terrible secret burden he had carried. The anger I had felt was replaced by an overwhelming wave of love and gratitude. He hadn't abandoned me in his illness. He had been fighting for me in the only way he could. He had been a warrior, hiding in plain sight. This money wasn't dirty. It was earned with the last dregs of his strength, the last beats of his heart. It was the purest money in the world. The last letter was dated just 3 days before he was admitted to the hospital for the final time. His handwriting was almost illegible. I can't drive anymore, Sarah. It's over. I think I have about 70,000 in the box. It's not enough to make you rich, but I hope it's enough for a new start. A deposit on an apartment, a reliable car. Time to find a job you love. Time to heal. Don't grieve for me. I'm okay. My only regret is that I have to leave you. Go build a beautiful life, Sarah. You deserve it. I'll be watching. I love you more than all the stars. I sat in the quiet of the minivan for a long time, the letters spread across my lap. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The money in the back was no longer a source of fear. It was a gift, a legacy, the final project of a master builder. And then there was the audio recorder. With a trembling hand, I picked it up and pressed play. His voice filled the small space of the van. It was weak, raspy, but it was him. Hey, Sarah girl, he began, his voice thick with emotion. If you're hearing this, I guess you figured it all out. Smartest woman I ever knew. He coughed, a dry, painful sound. I just I wanted you to hear my voice one more time. The letters, they don't tell you everything. They don't tell you how much I miss your laugh, or the way you hum when you're reading. I'm sitting here in this van, and all I can think about is you. Please don't be mad that I lied. I just wanted to give you a clean slate. Something the banks and the hospitals couldn't touch. Something that was just yours. He paused, and I could hear him take a ragged breath. This isn't the end, Sarah. It's a beginning. Use this. Live. Be happy. Find love again when you're ready. Don't let my memory be an anchor. Let it be a sail. Okay? Promise me. The recording ended with a soft click. I promised. I whispered it aloud in the empty van. I promise, David. I gathered the letters, my treasures, and put them carefully back in the manila envelope. I looked at the smaller envelope, the one marked, "For a lawyer." I knew what I had to do. This wasn't just about the money. It was about honoring his sacrifice by being smart, by being careful, by building the life he had given his own to provide. I started the van. The engine turned over on the first try, humming with a quiet, steady power. I pulled out of space G42, leaving the empty parking spot behind, and drove toward the airport exit, toward the rest of my life. The money, it turned out, was just over $78,000. It felt like a fortune. The first thing I did was check out of the Sundown Inn. I didn't tell the clerk my story. I just handed him the key and said, "Thank you." He grunted. It was the perfect anonymous end to that chapter. I spent a week in a much nicer, cleaner hotel, using the time to sleep, eat real food, and plan. I found a legal aid society and made an appointment. I brought them the sealed envelope. It contained a detailed ledger of all of David's trips, dates, and payments, along with a signed confession of his undeclared work. His final letter had instructed me to find an honest tax lawyer, declare the money as a posthumous inheritance of income, and pay whatever taxes were owed. He wanted everything to be clean. Legitimate. For me. The lawyer, a kind, sharp woman named Ms. Chen, handled it all. After taxes and fees, I was left with just under $60,000. It was more than enough. I sold my old sedan for a few $100s. I kept the minivan. It was my inheritance, my connection to him. I didn't stay in the city. The memories were too thick, too painful. I drove south toward the sun. I found a small town by the coast, a quiet place with a nice library and the smell of salt in the air. I used the money to put a down payment on a tiny cottage just a few blocks from the beach. It had a little patch of land out back, overgrown with weeds. I knew, as I stood there looking at it, that the first thing I would do is plant a garden. It's been a year since that day in the motel. Life is quiet now. It's simple. I have a part-time job at the local library. I spend my afternoons in my garden, my hands in the dirt, coaxing flowers from the soil. The minivan is parked in my driveway, clean and well-maintained. Sometimes, on nights when I can't sleep, I'll go sit in the driver's seat and listen to his voice on the recorder. I was not made rich by what I found in those walls. Not in the way people think. The money was a tool, a bridge from a life of desperation to a life of possibility. But the real wealth was in the letters. The real treasure was the truth. The knowledge that I was loved so fiercely, so completely, that a man would spend his last ounce of strength building a secret world to save me. That is an inheritance you cannot spend, and one that will never run out. Home is not a place. I learned that in the 53 nights I spent in my car. And it's not just a roof over your head, as I learned in room 207. Home is a foundation. It's the strength and love that others build inside you. David gave me that. He couldn't give me a house of wood and nails, so he gave me one made of courage and sacrifice. And in this small cottage, by the sea, I am finally living in it. This story isn't just about finding money. It's about finding meaning in the aftermath of loss. It's about understanding that sometimes the greatest acts of love are the ones we never see. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. It means the world to me to be able to share this. My hope is that these stories can be a small light for people navigating their own darkness. If you feel that, I hope you'll subscribe and become part of this community. And please, in the comments below, tell me what this story taught you about the meaning of home, or share a story about a second chance you were given. I read every single one. You are not alone.